Kia ora, I'm Gwen McClure. On The Detail today, how the Pacific Islands became a perfect spot for the Catholic Church to hide abusive clergy. A warning, this episode talks about sexual assault.
Sins of the fathers.
Case after case of alleged sexual misconduct.
The Catholic Church is facing scandals and being forced to pay millions of dollars.
The bishop was warned about Carlson's behavior, but kept moving him around.
Allegations of abuse and subsequent cover-ups by the Catholic Church go back decades and decades and span the globe.
The findings are both appalling and familiar. The crimes span more than 70 years.
An independent commission looking into the sexual abuse of minors in the Portuguese Catholic Church said it has documented over 4,800 victims.
By 1,670 members of the Catholic clergy in Germany.
Calls for a royal commission into sexual abuse and its alleged cover-up within the Catholic Church.
After nearly 3 years investigating the French Catholic Church, a commission says about 330,000 children were victims.
The Roman Catholic Church in the Australian state of Victoria has revealed to a parliamentary hearing
a News Hub investigation into historic allegations of abuse at a Catholic-run orphanage in Upper Hutt.
A report from the Vatican found two popes either ignored, overlooked, or downplayed allegations.
Investigates a scathing report just released today about the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church.
It shows that nearly 2,000 children have been abused here in Illinois.
4 years ago, Pope Francis promised to root out paedophilia within the church when many sex abuse cases came to light around the world.
The latest story is close to home. Catholic clergy or missionaries accused of abuse who were transferred to the Pacific. Some went on to abuse more victims. New Zealander Pete McKenzie is a freelance journalist who broke the story for the New York Times.
Our investigation found at least 34 Catholic priests and missionaries who had allegedly or been found to have committed abuse against children, largely in the United States, in Australia, in Britain, and for our purposes, in New Zealand, and were subsequently moved to at least 15 Pacific Island nations and territories, from Papua New Guinea to Fiji to Samoa to Guam and more. And notably, we found that in at least 13 of those cases, church superiors knew that those priests and missionaries had been accused or even convicted of abuse before the movement happened, which effectively shielded them from scrutiny. And after those transfers occurred, it's really hard to know what happened next because the Pacific is such a devout place and the pressure on potential survivors of abuse is so extreme. We know that at least 3 of those priests then reoffended in the Pacific, committing further abuse, often dozens of times.
So these priests and missionaries, I should say, were largely from developed nations, getting transferred into the Pacific. You say that it's hard to know what happened next because the Pacific is so devout. Do you think that's a tactic? Do you think that the church deliberately moved these men into that region because of that?
I can't speak to the knowledge of the church, but the Pacific Ocean is, by some measures, the most Christian region in the world. You know, these are countries which largely have populations that are over 95% Christian. A significant number of those Christians are Catholic, devout Catholics. In places like Papua New Guinea, it's 25% or more of the population are Catholic. So these are extremely religious places where priests are often deified. I spoke to one survivor, a man called Felix Fremlin, who lives in Fiji, and he described the act of speaking against the church as effectively like speaking against God. When he reported his abuse to his dad beat him. So in many of these cases, we can't know why priests or missionaries were moved, but we do know that they were moved to a place which was the perfect place to hide. In some cases, we know that they were deliberately moved so that they wouldn't cause further problems. That's the case of a priest named Dennis McCallendon, for example, who's by some measures Australia's most notorious priest. And church officials knew that he was accused of abusing many young girls in his Australian parish. And so to get rid of the problem, they bought him a plane ticket to Papua New Guinea and said he should move along. And so he spent 5 years in Papua New Guinea as a result. So we know that that's the kind of tactic, that's the kind of approach that are being used in at least some of these cases.
And the fact that the Catholic Church has moved priests accused of abuse to different places is hardly surprising. I mean, that's been well documented for years and years and years now. But what is it about this case or these cases that's different to you?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've known for a long time that the Catholic Church applies what survivors describe as the geographic cure. And so in New Zealand, for example, we know that many priests were shuffled from community to community, from parish to parish, after allegations of abuse were raised against them by parents or by children or by students. What this tells us is twofold. First, some of those priests that were shuffled around New Zealand, shuffled around the United States, shuffled around Australia, were then moved abroad to the Pacific Islands. But what's particularly important about this pattern that we've found is that they were being moved to an extremely vulnerable place. Mm-hmm. The deeply religious nature of the Pacific Islands, the fact that it's so far from authorities that might be pursuing these men for prosecution, the fact that it's so far from senior Catholic clergy who theoretically could have applied some level of scrutiny, the fact that they were moved, often without local officials being told of their background, being told of the allegations against them, all created the kind of perfect conditions for reoffending, with very few protections against that from happening.
So largely when a priest was moved somewhere, the place they were transferred to didn't know. There was no one there who knew of their background.
Yeah, so a good example of this is Fiji and an Australian priest named Julian Fox. Mm-hmm. Julian Fox was an extremely senior priest in a Catholic order called the Salesians. He rose so high, in fact, that he was the local leader of the Salesians in Australia. And then in around 1999, he moved to Fiji. And either before or very soon after, the records on this conflict, he was accused of sexual abuse by a minor. And despite the fact that church officials knew about that allegation, despite the fact that they settled that allegation with a monetary compensation payment, they didn't tell church officials in Fiji. And so Julian Fox was then in Fiji as a teacher at a local seminary surrounded by religious schools, as a minister in this, at that time, quite remote Pacific island, with very little scrutiny and with no awareness by local officials that would have allowed them to put protections in place.
So you've just talked about this geographic cure. It is a cure, right? I mean, in the case of Julian Fox, if he'd gone back to Australia, he might have faced the law there. But there's sort of this perfect thing that happens where this operates outside of the law, right? Where people can just be shuffled around the world and operate, I guess, with impunity.
You're right. It's a temporary cure to the problems facing these men in terms of law enforcement. So for Julian Fox, he spent a few years in Fiji, and then instead of returning to Australia, where police were investigating, police wanted him to come back. He then moved to the Vatican, and he spent a further few years at the Vatican. And there's all of these fascinating internal documents that show that there was a tussle between church officials about whether or not he should go back, and church officials ultimately dismissed that plan. So it took him, roughly a decade to finally return to Australia, where he was eventually convicted. So being overseas, that time he spent in Fiji and then the Vatican, was a cure to the law enforcement problems that he faced. What it wasn't a cure to for many of these men was the problems of sexual abuse. We know that in at least 3 cases after being shifted abroad, these men reoffended. And so the geographic cure that survivors describe helps the church, doesn't necessarily help victims.
So how does something like this happen again and again and again? Pete points to 2 factors.
In the Pacific Islands, the church is so deeply interwoven into local culture, into local society. When I travel through the Pacific, I very frequently hear the description of the 3 pillars of society, which is traditional authority, chiefs, culture, custom, government, and then equally powerful, if not more, the church. And when the church has that much power in a place, it's very hard for a national government or for local officials to apply that level of scrutiny.
Then there's the way the church is organized.
In many of these cases, these brothers and these priests belonged to religious orders, which are pretty much self-governing. So once they're invited to a nation or to a territory by the local bishop, they kind of run themselves, as one person I spoke to described it. And so brothers could fly in and out, priests could fly in and out with very little scrutiny from normal church authorities. Others belonged to more conventional dioceses. and were nominally under the supervision of the local bishop. But the same person I spoke to, Michelle Mulverhill, a former nun who worked as an advisor to the Catholic Church in Australia on several of these cases, she said that, not asking questions has become really normal in a lot of these places. And so what we saw was this transfer of men who were facing these accusations, who had these problematic histories, with very little scrutiny, with very little oversight.
I'm going to get you to explain a little bit more about that structure of supervision. Why is it that some places have, is it called a diocese? Is that the individual branch, I suppose? Is that right?
Yeah, so a diocese is the kind of regional unit that most people will be familiar with. It's the kind of local regional unit. And it kind of goes up from there. You'll have bishops to archbishops to cardinals to the Pope, the normal hierarchy that many people are familiar with. But the Catholic Church is this sprawling kingdom. It has so many different little pockets of authority. And these Catholic religious orders that I'm talking about might have been founded decades or centuries ago as charitable groups, as monastic orders, as missionary organizations, and they operate separately to that traditional structure. So they report through their own line of authority. But ultimately, importantly, both sets of groups, whether traditional dioceses or religious orders, ultimately report to the Vatican. The Pope is at the head of that chain.
Okay. So where is Pope Francis in all this? He's currently on this tour through Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Has he said anything about this article or these revelations?
So Pope Francis landed in Papua New Guinea on Friday. It's his first ever visit to the Pacific Islands, and it's the first visit by a pope to Oceania in 3 decades. And he hasn't responded. He hasn't addressed it.
The next stop on the tour was East Timor, where he did address it briefly in a speech to officials. He said, "Let us not forget the many children and adolescents whose dignity has been violated. The phenomenon is manifesting all over the world. We are all called to do everything possible to prevent every kind of abuse and guarantee a healthy and peaceful childhood for all young people."
East Timor has a public and quite problematic history of local church officials committing abuse against children. But it's a difficult thing for the Pope, understandably. It's a challenging issue to face, which is part of why this article and other articles like it are so important. It's important to force the church to confront a legacy of abuse in places which it might not want to confront them in.
There's a priest in New Zealand who you talk about in this article. What do we know about him? Is he still serving in the church?
There's one New Zealand priest who we speak about in the article, one of many, but he's still serving. And that's Cardinal John Dew, who was accused of sexual abuse earlier this year by a survivor who spoke to Newshub.
Newshub can reveal the Vatican is investigating New Zealand's highest-ranked Catholic over child sex abuse allegations.
The complaint against Cardinal John Dew was filed last year by a man who claims that he was abused while staying at an Upper Hutt orphanage in the late 70s.
Steve Carvell took his complaint to the police, the Royal Commission and the church last year. A detective spent months investigating but closed the case last month. Police told Newshub they could not reach the evidential test to provide a reasonable prospect of conviction. The Cardinal, who until May was the leader of the Catholic Church in New Zealand and until now has never had a complaint laid against him, has strenuously denied the claims, telling me it never happened.
What we found is that Cardinal John Dew actually spent 2 years serving in the Cook Islands, which is common for quite a few of the New Zealand priests that we found. And so we can see that in many of these cases, New Zealand priests, like priests from all of these other Western countries, are moving around the region. Cardinal Dew, it should be noted, has been cleared by a church inquiry, and he denies the allegations of abuse against him. And as a result, he's been cleared to return to his public duties. And
is he in a public-facing role? I mean, is he interacting with people?
He's retired.
He's retired, okay.
And to my knowledge, he is in a public-facing role.
Okay. One of the people who you spoke to for your article was a New Zealander, Christopher Longhurst, who is from the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. He said he was going to push for answers from the Pope when he was in Papua New Guinea. Have you heard anything from him on how that visit was?
Yeah, so Mr. Longhurst represents an organisation called SNAP, which, if any of the listeners have watched Spotlight, will be very familiar to them.
They knew, and they let it happen. 2 kids. Okay? It could have been you. It could have been me. It could have been any of us. We gotta nail these scumbags. We gotta show people that nobody can get away with this. Not a priest or a cardinal or a freaking pope.
It's a collection of survivors of those abused by priests that is scattered around the world. There's branches in Australia, there's branches in New Zealand, and there's a small branch in Oceania led by Felix Fremlin, the survivor who I spoke to. So Fremlin, Longhurst, and a handful of other survivors from SNAP have issued a public declaration. They've written as well to the Pope, urging him to confront what they see as this problematic legacy in Oceania. But it's really difficult for these survivors because, again, for all the reasons we've been talking about, there's so much pressure for survivors in the Pacific not to come forward. And so, for example, SNAP doesn't have a branch in Papua New Guinea or in East Timor, places where the Pope is going to be visiting. And it seems unlikely that it will, given that pressure. And so pushing the Pope from a distance is quite hard.
Spotlight came out in 2015.
When you're a poor kid from a poor family and a priest pays attention to you, you feel special. How do you say no to God?
So that was almost a decade ago. Do you think we've seen progress in that time? Do you think things are better for survivors and they're getting justice?
There's very widespread recognition that this is a problem. And the Pope has apologised multiple times and said explicitly that he expects allegations to be reported, priests to be held to account. But this is still a sprawling organisation with a very difficult history to confront. And importantly, so far, the scandal of clerical abuse has largely been confined to developed countries. What this piece shows us is that this went far beyond places like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand. And so as countries in the Pacific Islands, as countries in Africa, in Asia confront this problem, I think we're likely to see more challenges emerging and a greater level of scrutiny needing to be applied.
What kind of care, if any, are these survivors getting in the Pacific? You talked about Felix Fremlin, who's in Fiji. What kind of care is he getting?
Very little is the upshot. You know, there's not a lot of mental health support, if any mental health support, in countries in the Pacific. The region actually faces an acute crisis of mental health care. And so as a result, for people like Fremlin, for survivors in his position, as he puts it, the only support that they get is by sitting down and talking with each other, which is great that they've got that. That doesn't go the whole way in getting the job done. In terms of monetary compensation, Felix and a few other survivors in Fiji have received small payments from church authorities in recognition of their claims. But importantly, despite the fact that Felix Fremlin claims he was abused by New Zealand missionaries, the amount of that settlement was dramatically different to what he would have gotten if he had been abused in New Zealand. And so, again, we're seeing a disparity in the treatment of Pacific survivors, even at this stage.
The missionaries who Felix has said abused him, were they known to have abused before getting moved to Fiji? Or was that a separate situation?
That was a separate situation.
Okay.
So the two missionaries in that case, men called Terence Payne and Bertrand Hodgkins, were not known to have abused before moving to Fiji. And their abuse in the Pacific was brilliantly first reported by Steve Kilgallen at Stuff. And so we actually see an entirely different problem there as well, of not only were there priests from Western countries who abused or are alleged to have abused and then moved, but also a whole different category of priests and missionaries who transferred to the Pacific and then abused once they got there.
A lot of this is historic. Have you seen suggestions that abuse is ongoing?
I can't speak to whether or not abuse is ongoing, but we do know that some of these priests and missionaries with problematic histories were serving in Pacific Island nations until the 2000s and until the 2010s. One is still serving as an itinerant priest in the Pacific. And so while the bulk of the men that we focused on are historic, this is a pattern that stretches quite close to the present.
Throughout your article, you have a few mentions of approaching people in the Catholic Church for comment and not getting much. Were you surprised at all by kind of the lack of response, or were you satisfied with what you got there?
I was not satisfied. I think that's safe to say. Very much not satisfied with the response that I got. In some cases, church officials did not respond. In others, they declined to comment. In one case, they declined to comment explicitly, they said, on the advice of a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And then in other cases, they said they weren't responsible, that other orders, other dioceses were in charge, were responsible. And then finally, in a significant number of cases, church orders or dioceses said that they only received reports of abuse once these men returned from the Pacific. So we see a real spectrum of responses there. And I think it's for the reader as well to determine their level of satisfaction with those responses.
Yeah, okay. We've talked a bit about the victims, but have you had conversations with survivors about how they feel when they learned that the person who abused them actually had a history of this and was moved to their country with that known?
Most survivors in the Pacific keep their experiences really secret because they're scared of the pressure and the backlash they might face as a result. Mm-hmm. So the survivor that I spoke to, Felix Fremlin, who was comfortable with going on the record, when he learned of that pattern, he felt partly vindicated and partly just tired. Mm-hmm. And advocates that I spoke to, people like Michelle Mulvihill, the former nun and advisor to the church, also felt vindicated. She had been warning of the Pacific being used as a dumping ground for literally decades. And so when I was able to show her this pattern of men, for her, it was a recognition that those warnings were prescient.
So like we said earlier, this is shocking, but unfortunately not surprising. Were there things that surprised you, though, in your reporting?
I was shocked in the cases where church superiors knew about how explicit they were about the problems these men posed. A lot of the reporting for this was reading through thousands of pages of documents, from government inquiries to court records to individual media reports about individual men, to survivor testimonies and witness accounts. And what comes through in those documents is how explicit church officials were in some cases about the need to move the men.
Wow.
And how explicit they were about the fact that abuse had happened. You had Dennis McAllendon telling church officials about, I quote, indiscretions with the little ones only. And that's chilling.
Wow.
And so I was shocked by that.
Pete's story covered the cases of 34 abusers or alleged abusers. 22 of them were convicted or admitted to allegations, or were considered by the church to be credibly accused. 4 died before the claims were made public. 6 were investigated and or charged, but did not stand trial or had their trial stayed for various reasons. The other 2, John Ju and a priest still working in Guam, both deny allegations. That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Ben Pierce and produced by Alexi Russell and Davina Zimmer. Thank you to Pete McKenzie. I'm Gwen McClure. Ka kite ano.